It's possible that you guys have been following this political and economic news from the Ukraine. It says here that, this is off CBC, in a clear warning to Ukraine, Putin on Wednesday ordered massive military exercises involving most of the military units in Western Russia. As part of the exercises, fighter jets were put on combat alert and were patrolling the border, Russia's defense ministry said in the statement. It didn't specify the areas where patrol missions were being conducted. The military also announced measures to tighten security at the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet on the Crimean Peninsula in southeastern Ukraine. There's a rumor that I believe it was Brezhnev, gave the Crimea to the Ukraine when he was drunk. The military maneuvers prompted a sharp rebuke from U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, who warned Russia that any military intervention in Ukraine would be a grave mistake. Why did I tell you that? Well, it's for the same reason that I've been conducting these last few lectures on phenomenological and existential ideas in psychotherapy. And I think I mentioned to you that these ideas are often not covered anymore in personality classes, but I think that's a big mistake because I think that these theories have more to tell us about what happened in the 20th century than any other theories that I've ever come across. And that's very important because the terrible mass movements of the 20th century occurred because of the nature of people's personality. It's a mistake not to concentrate on factors that play that massive a role in determining the destiny of the entire world. And, it may seem to you that the Soviet Union is a long ways away since it collapsed in 1989. But there's no evidence that we're done with it yet. I mean, Putin was a KGB officer, and the KGB was the Soviet Secret Service. And the Soviet Secret Service was one catastrophically awful organization. And the tension that's occurring in the Ukraine right now, that looks like it might explode into civil war, and hopefully not, is still a consequence of the remnants of the pathologies that dominated the Soviet Union for most of the 20th century. It isn't clear to me that we've really learned what we had to learn from what happened in Nazi Germany, say, and in Mao's China, which is obviously still run by the Communist Party, or in the Soviet Union, even though there's been a reprieve for the last 35 years or so. Nietzsche, in particular, predicted what was going to happen in the 20th century. I'm going to read you something that he wrote. I'm going to try to tell you today why the events in the 20th century happened. So the mass genocidal movements in particular, which were probably the defining characteristic of the 20th century. And then also what that has to do with individual psychology. My first degree was in political science, and I was interested in political science because I was interested fundamentally in the reason that human societies went to war. And when I was studying political science, which is quite a long time ago, the fundamental theory that underlie political scientists' explanations for conflict were economic. People fight over resources. And that never seemed reasonable to me because, first of all, obviously, many wars are fought for other reasons than resources. Two Central American countries, I think it was Guatemala and Honduras, if I remember correctly, went to war over a soccer game. So the outcome of the disputed outcome of a soccer game. And even if you do think that the reason that groups of people engage in conflict are for economic reasons, that doesn't exactly explain much, because that doesn't explain whether they're fighting because of absolute differences in wealth or because of relative discrepancies in wealth, and those are very, very different causal elements. And then even if people do fight for economic reasons, which means they're fighting for things that they value, it isn't exactly clear why people value what they value, because different societies value different things. So economics, in the final analysis, ends up being a shallow explanation. And I pursued economic and political and sociological explanations for social conflict for a long time, but eventually they became untenable to me, and that's partly why I went and studied clinical psychology, because it struck me that the right level of analysis for understanding mass movements like the Nazi movement or the ideological possession that characterized the Stalinist Soviets or Mao's communists. To me, those were failings of individual personality. And the most astute writers that I've ever read who describe what they assumed to be the causes of these terrible conflicts made the same point. I mean, Russia, you can read this if you read Tolstoy, for example. In Tolstoy's Confessions, Russia was really the last country that underwent the transformations that were associated with the Enlightenment. So when Tolstoy was a young person in the late 19th century, he said he could literally remember when the announcement spread through his school that God was dead. Now, the Western Europeans had been working on that idea for a couple of hundred years, with the dawn of scientific thinking. But the Russians were very backwards in some sense. They were never affected by the conflict between rationality and religion until it happened all at once. And it happened all at once at the end of the 19th century. And the consequence of that, it's complicated, but the consequence of that was that the monarchy exploded. And then the consequence of that was that the Russians were left with nothing. And the consequence of that was the Bolshevik Revolution. Solzhenitsyn wrote the Gulag Archipelago published it in the early 1970s. And there were two things that made that book very striking. One was the stories that he told were so unbelievably powerful that you couldn't read them and not believe it was true. And that was even the case if you were a devoted Marxist. And at that time, in the universities, and in many ways it hasn't changed that much, the universities in the West were dominated by Marxists. And to some degree that was ethically inexcusable, because people had known since the 1950s, especially since George Orwell wrote, people had known since the 1950s that the Stalinist state was murderous beyond belief. So Stalin, for example, killed 6 million Ukrainians in the 1930s. He starved them to death. Because all of the farmers had been collectivized at that point. And what that meant was all the good farmers had been killed, and all the resentful farmers had been given the land, and then they collectivized the farms, and then Stalin took all the food to feed the cities, or to starve the Ukrainians, depending on how you look at it. And the edicts were so harsh that if you were Ukrainian, and you had a family, and they were starving, and you went into a field after it had been harvested, and you picked out individual grains from the dirt to gather in a bowl to feed your family, if you got caught, then they would shoot you. Solzhenitsyn observed this, and he was very interested in how this system developed. And his conclusion after decades of thinking was that the reason the Russian system was able to maintain itself fundamentally was because individuals were willing to give up the responsibility of their own relationship to the truth, to the state, and constantly lie to themselves about everything. And that if the individuals that composed the state had refused to accept things that they knew full well to be untrue, that the state wouldn't have been able to survive. And, Solzhenitsyn's case is very strong because in some sense, he was the first person who told the truth about the Gulag Archipelago, which was this chain of prison camps that the Soviets had erected on which their economy was essentially based. He was the first person who really told the truth about that. And he hit the foundations of Marxist theory so hard that, well, partly it collapsed and partly it went underground into movements like postmodernism. So his proposition, it's a Dostoevskian proposition actually, that one person who stopped lying could overturn a tyranny. It's a hard thing to believe, but there's been multiple examples of that sort of thing in the 20th century. It happened with Gandhi, it happened with Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, it happened with Nelson Mandela, and happened with Solzhenitsyn. So those are pretty powerful examples of the power of a single individual who refuses to accept the conventional lie. And Dostoevsky had already figured out by that point that the consequence of the new ideas swimming into Russia and undermining Orthodox Christianity, which was the natural culture in some sense of Russia, was going to be either nihilism or totalitarianism. And he examined the propositions of totalitarianism, and the propositions of totalitarianism were essentially utopian. So the idea was, it's like a cult, accept this mode of being, accept this interpretation of the world, and society will advance towards a point where, well, say in the case of communism, wealth is equally distributed and everyone is free. And when it was laid out in the world, it was an absolute catastrophe. And Dostoevsky criticized this before it even happened. He said, look, human beings do not want utopia. We're too insane for that. You had everything you wanted just given to you. All you do is go crazy just so that you wouldn't have to be bored by all that perfection. You destroy it so that the irrational element that's inside of you, so this Dionysian element, could leap out and live. And so whatever utopia is, it's not the permanent solution to all of your problems.